May I introduce Professor Michele Salzman. Professor Salzman is a leading scholar of the religious and social history of late antiquity. Her work was described as informative, insightful, and provocative. She is an associate editor of the journal Studies in Late Antiquity, and she was appointed to the Board of Trustees at the American Academy of Rome. Professor Salzman is affiliated with the American Philological Association, the Archaeological Institute of America, the North American Patristic Society, and the Society of Biblical Literature. She was granted many prestigious awards and fellowships, of which I will only state a visiting fellowship at the Institute for Advanced Studies here at the Hebrew University in 2014, and the Dilworth Fellowship at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton University in 2018. She was also awarded a visiting fellowship at the Institute for Classical Studies at the University of London in 2017. Professor Salzman is the author of many books and the editor of a few more, among which On Roman Time, the Codex Gallandera 354, and the Rhythms of Urban Life in Late Antiquity, The Making of Christian Aristocracy, and the first book of the Letters of Symmachus, which he translated with Michael Roberts. Today, Professor Salzman will talk of her new book that will soon be released by Cambridge University Press, The Falls of Rome, Crises, Resilience, and Resurgence in Late Antiquity. We will have questions. We will have time for questions after the talk. So if you have a question for Professor Salzman, please send me, More Hachby, a message with your name, and I'll ask you to present your question. Or alternatively, you can send the question and I will read it. That being said, Professor Salzman, thank you for agreeing to be here, and the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you. And before I share my screen, I want to thank you for the invitation. All the more in these times of the end of the pandemic, it's really important to sort of reach out, and I really appreciate the invitation and opportunity to see old friends and meet some new friends. And also I want to thank particularly More Hugby for your help in organizing this and arranging it. So thank you all. I'm looking forward to the conversation as well. So now I'm going to share my screen, and I was very much excited to be able to talk to you really about my forthcoming book. Let's see if I can make it, there you go, to share with you some of the ideas. And as Maura said, it is slated to come out with Cambridge this year, they tell me, in July. We hope it's true. So the book is called The Falls of Rome, Crises, Resilience, and Resurgence in Late Antiquity. For centuries, indeed, historians have engaged in a really lively debate with Gibbon's paradigm of the decline and fall of Rome to describe the last centuries of the Western Roman Empire from the, let's say, the 3rd to the 7th century. Books like that of Brian Ward Perkins are just one of many. His is very provocatively entitled The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization. These have periodically revived Gibbon's interpretive framework by emphasizing the German invasions as the end of civilization. This catastrophist perspective is famously at odds with an alternative understanding by historians like Peter Brown and the late Alan Cameron. Since the 1970s, these continuists have argued for the ongoing vitality of Rome's legal and cultural institutions, and especially focused on innovations in religion. More recently, a third perspective has emerged. Scholars like Jack Goody and Mark Humphreys, Walter Scheidel have dismissed these paradigms as no less than the Western theft of history, and they focus instead on larger scale developments throughout the ancient world within a more or less comparative framework. In my view, none of these approaches captures the creative resilience of this period. The impact of individual and collective choices during these pivotal 3 centuries is significant and moving. To go beyond these well-known narratives, I focus in this book instead on the elite who contested to rebuild Rome, the city, and its empire, following military and political disasters, with a particular attention to the Roman senatorial aristocracy. I've chosen to focus on the city of Rome and not on a subset of cities or the Western Roman Empire writ large, because Rome's influence has shaped the outlines of its Mediterranean empire for centuries. And in late antiquity, Rome was still the largest city in the Western Mediterranean. And it still was its imperial capital with a resident aristocracy and prestigious institutions that had enabled Romans to rule since the 3rd century BC. The city remained in late antiquity, in the words of the late Robert Malchus, the head, center, and sum of the world. In my forthcoming book, I examined 5 political and military crises that ancient and modern historians have considered critical for understanding the decline and fall of Rome. By focusing on how these crises led Romans to act to recover their city, I offer an alternative perspective for understanding these last 3 centuries, its imperial city, and its aristocracy in particular. And I argue that the senatorial aristocracy remained at the center of the city's recovery. And the resilience of Roman senatorial aristocrats, who time and again used their resources to fuel the city's resurgence in the midst of loss, is both significant and moving. And it's the very definition of resilience used by historians like Kyle Harper, for instance. To fully understand the resilience of the Roman senatorial aristocracy, we have to take into account that they themselves were the products of a culture in which competition for influence and prestige acted as a stimulant. Crises brought about changes in the late Roman world that rendered politics in the late antique city more diffuse and more variable. Personal relations had always played a great role, but they had played an even greater role than they had previously in winning power and building social networks that enabled material and political advancement. This competition energized rather than enervated senatorial aristocrats during the last 3 centuries of the Western Empire. At times, it's true, the actions led to disaster, failure, destruction. But their intervention also allowed for the recovery of urban life and society, both of which have been overshadowed by the assumptions that come with alternative paradigms for understanding the end of late ancient Rome. So to give you some sense of the resilience and I think real power of late Roman senatorial aristocrats in relation to other elites, that is, I believe, so often understated by those who write the history of the city and its empire, I'm going to focus today on a particular time of crisis, a particular moment in history. 476. It's the conventional date for the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Indeed, Edward Gibbon thought that he might end his narrative there with, basing his views on the notion that this was the end of the empire, because we had the last boy emperor, Romulus Augustus, later called Augustulus, who removed himself from power, was removed from power in 476. But 476, this date, this moment, is very misleading in my view. Actually, the crisis that emerged in 470, that culminated with the civil war of 472, fought in the streets of Rome, was arguably the most devastating fall of the city in the 5th century. It divided families as well as the population at large, and it wreaked significant damage on the urban landscape. Nonetheless, the willingness of senators to return to Rome and to work with the military under the leadership of Ricimer, the general, it laid the foundations for the resurgence of the city. In the aftermath of the Civil War of 472, indeed by 476, senatorial aristocrats had reunited to restore the city and its institutions, that is, the Senate and the papacy. Senatorial aristocrats took advantage of their opportunities after the Civil War and strove to rebuild society with or without an imperial presence. At the same time, aristocrats continued to shape the religious contours of the church in society. Senatorial aristocrats crafted a new working relationship after the Civil War but they also shaped the religious life of the city. In particular, they aimed to limit the financial abuses of the papacy. These actions thus undermined the bishop's claims to dominance in Rome. Finally, aristocratic responses to 472 enabled the rise of a Germanic kingdom in Italy by 476, with senators willing to take the same high offices that would enable them to govern Italy on behalf of their new rulers, just as they had earlier for Roman emperors. So, a little history lesson. And I'm going to need some water. To get some sense of how life had changed in the late 5th century city of Rome, a map is always useful. The Western Empire at this date was reduced mostly to Italy, and this is around 454. Obviously, you're all familiar. Italy and sections of Dalmatia, with a few sections in Gaul. The Vandals had established themselves in their kingdom in northern Africa, Swaves in most of Spain. Britain was lost to Roman control. However, of course, the Eastern Empire persisted around Constantinople. The shrinking of the Western Empire, with its renewed focus on Italy, placed an even greater emphasis on the city of Rome. Although emperors had in the early 5th century resided in Milan and Ravenna, by the 440s, emperors and generals returned to Rome, seeking stability and support, I argue, of Roman central aristocrats. In 470, the Western emperor, Procopius and Anthemius, who's got a lovely Solidus here, resided in Rome. He was an experienced general, a senator, a Greek, sent by the Eastern Emperor Leo to help secure the peninsula on the eve of a major attack on the Vandals. The Senate accepted this Greek emperor, in part because of their continuing idea of shared rulership between the East and West, some would argue. But there also was a material advantage. Anthemius came to the West with a large amount of gold, perhaps more gold than any other emperor of the 5th century, and also a number of troops who were going to help in the fight against the Vandals. Some aristocrats also supported Anthemius because of his religious policies. We hear of Anthemius's attempt to control the influence of the Bishop of Rome and also to allow for greater religious diversity, as, for example, the return to Rome of several Christian sects, as well as the pagan Neoplatonist Messius Phoebus Severus. The key military figure in the West throughout, of course, was Ricimer, a German by birth who had spent his career at the top of echelons of power in the service of Rome. Scholars wonder why Ricimer accepted Anthemius, a Greek emperor. Why not try to assume authority? And I argue, on the contrary, that this resolution was a good one in his eyes, that is, Ricimer's eyes. Ricimer retained control of his troops, while the East sent additional troops to fight the Vandals. Ricimer also gained a wife, the daughter of Anthemius, and their children would bring Ricimer a formal role in dynastic succession. Contemporaries saw his authority in Rome as second only to the emperor. In short, Ricimer would do what he wanted without the formal title of emperor. Alas, this arrangement did not last. The expedition against the Vandals failed, as did Anthemius' attempt to curb an uprising in Gaul. Tensions between the general and the emperor grew. When Anthemius grew dangerously ill, he alleged a conspiracy by friends of Ricimer and then executed them without a trial. The 7th century Greek historian John of Antioch, using sources that we no longer have, tells us how in his anger, I translate, Ricimer left Rome and summoned 6,000 men who were under his command for the war against the Vandals. Ricimer went north to Milan and then proceeded to call in support from the other barbarian kings. So he took over control of northern Italy. The stage was set for civil war. Negotiations failed, and Ricimer marched on Rome and sieged Anthemius in the city for a period of at least 5 to 6 months, starting likely in October 471 and continuing through July 472. Anthemius stayed within the walls of Rome, and he wasn't the first emperor to do so, relying on those walls. On his side were those who, as John puts it, hoi in tele, who were in authority, meaning senators, magistrates, and their retainers. We do not have an exact number from our sources, but one pro-Anthemius source does add that the people, the demos, supported the emperor. At least some of them did. Anthemius clearly was hoping for additional reinforcements. But the Civil War really divided aristocrats as well. Indeed, some scholars, Giuseppe Zecchini and Umberto Roberto, for instance, have argued that they divided based on Rome's two most famous families, the Anici and the Decii, kind of like the Hatfields and the McCoys. The Anici were pro-barbarian, pro-Christian, anti-Eastern. The Decii opposing them, of course, were the opposite. There doesn't seem really good evidence for that clear familial separation. In fact, my own work supports that of Alan Cameron's view that this was no more than a Nicean myth. But there were aristocrats on both sides, that is clear. And divisions were split between Anthemius and Ricimer. Indeed, as our sources say, this was a civil war with aristocratic supporters, Decii and Anici, on both sides. In fact, both sides also relied on mercenaries. Anywhere from 10 to 20,000 men fought for Ricimer, and probably a similar number for Anthemius, who had stayed in Rome waiting for further reinforcements. The fighting in 472 was in fact more destructive to the city, its urban fabric, than the far more famous sack of Rome in 410. In 410, the Gothic leader Alaric had entered the city without a battle, and as an Arian, he didn't slaughter any of the inhabitants. He stayed there for 3 days. But in 472, the city itself became a battlefield. Ricimer camped across the Tiber River, and here on the map again is useful. Ricimer crossed across near modern St. Peter's and in Trastevere and the Janiculum, and he controlled the supplies, starving the city for some 5 months. Anthemius resided in Rome on the Palatine, and they held up there. One battle, which was ascribed by John the Deacon here near the modern mausoleum of Castle San Angelo, was particularly fierce. And we hear about the soldiers in the fortress throwing down the statues on the Ricimer's, throwing down the statues on the Anthemius's men. Anthemius's men fought valiantly, and they lost. When the emperor tried to flee, of course, Justin got pretending to be a monk. He went to the Church of San Carsagano here and was caught, and then was brutally murdered as well. The result was, as Paul the Deacon writes later, Rome was devastated by fire, by hunger and disease, and then was, quote, gravely ravaged by the greed of the looters, except for the two areas where Ricimer's men had camped, that is modern Trastevere and the Vatican area, this side of the Tiber. In the aftermath of this event, what one later 5th century pope called Civilis furor, civil madness, Roman senatorial and military elites acted quickly. The senators who survived returned to Rome and lent their support to the general Ricimer and the man whom he had designated to be the next ruler. And it's that rebirth or that rebuilding that I really want to look at. It was this man, Anicius Olybrius, who was a leading senator who had gone east and served in the Eastern Court, who was chosen or supported by Ricimer to be the next emperor. As a member of the wealthy Nician family, he was sent by the Emperor Leo to mediate the civil war between Anthemius and Gaiseric, but instead Ricimer persuaded Livius to take the throne. And indeed, Livius had really good connections. He was married to the daughter of the former emperor, Valentine III, and he had ties with the Vandal king Gaiseric. An excellent choice to reunite a divided aristocracy and at the same time gain legitimacy for a new emperor. The willingness of senators to return soon after 472, rather than retreat to their estates in Italy or the East, was one key to their continuing influence. Indeed, the senators had learned from past crises. Just 17 years earlier, senators had similarly returned quickly to Rome after the sack of 455. Indeed, they had after Majorian's demise, they returned to support Ricimer's candidate, the Senator Livius Severus, as I demonstrated in an article which I published in Antiquity Tardive. Ricimer's preference for senators as emperors had long been acceptable. Once again, now, after the Civil War, Ricimer sought senatorial support. It's worth emphasizing that neither he nor Livius took any action against those senators who had sided with Anthemius. Moreover, Ricimer and the Senate granted Anthemius an appropriate state funeral and burial, waiting for all this to happen before Livius took residence on the Palatine Hill. Such actions facilitated the reunification of the aristocracy behind the new government. Even Ricimer's unexpected death in August 472, just 40 days after the death of Anthemius, even after that, the senators continued to support Ricimer's successor, his nephew, the Burgundian noble king Gundobad. And the senators continued their support for Gundobad's government after the unexpected death of Glycerius in 472. The unexpected death of Livius. Glycerius, a commander of the imperial bodyguard, became the next emperor in March 473 through 474. So just within 2 years, a unified Senate allied with the military and started the work of restoring the city. And we actually can see that on the ground. An inscription from the Roman Forum in the area identified as the Atrium Minerva, which is the hallway before the Senate House of Rome, supplies really important information for the resilience and the rebuilding of Rome in the aftermath of 472. The restoration efforts took place in an area which really was full of meaning. This Atrium Minerva, or this porticus, along with the statue of Minerva, had been dedicated by the Emperor Augustus. The inscription records the restoration by an urban prefect, we might say mayor of Rome, who advertised the return to a blessed age, an inscription which is dated to 472, 473, right after the Civil War. Unfortunately, the inscription no longer survives, nor does the statue, but it can be reconstructed and such, and I'll just read the English. The statue of Minerva, broken by a falling roof, destroyed by a fire during a civic conflict, was restored by Nicias Achilles Agnatius Faustus, of senatorial status and aristocrat of the highest rank, a judge providing improvements and completing the work for the happiness of the age. Pro beatitudine temporis. This is a byword of the period. The restoration of a pagan statue by a man assumed to have been a Christian attests to reverence for the site, as well as a revival of antiquarian sentiments, as Carlos Machado has argued. But I want to emphasize instead the emotions that led, and the political moment that led to the choice of the statue. He called it simulacrum. It reinforces the sacred nature of the deity and expresses reverence for the Rome's past. The inscription also asserts what a standard Mediterranean idea that disasters strike due to divine anger. That is because of this recent civic conflict. A phrase that is reiterated in other references to 472. The prefect who undertook this work, Achilles Egonatius Faustus, of course, belonged to the family of the Anici, its first name. He would have a long, illustrious career under the German rulers of the late 5th century, but his restoration made a strong statement in favor of winning divine favor for a Senate now unified as a means of ensuring a more blessed future. Faustus was not alone in doing this, and there were other inscriptions by other aristocrats, one Quadratianus, who fixed the bath of Constantine, also destroyed by this deadly calamity. In this period of restoration, upwardly mobile elites also seized the opportunity for advancement, and some of them also left epigraphic evidence. The man who was Praetorian prefect of Italy, one Felix Himilco, likely a new man based on his name, also posted in an edict which he posted in Rome, expressed the hope that he would bring about the happiness, again, beatitudine, of a better time. And we hear about another new man who also active in Rome in this period between 472 and 476. The German general Balila was honored with a seat in the Colosseum as well, which has his name. And Balila also donated a church in Rome, following the patronage patterns of other senatorial elites. Under the Emperor Glycerius, the senatorial aristocracy also saw renewed limits on papal financial abuses, issues that had also concerned senators since the late 4th century. And indeed, it had also been an issue that had strained relations between Anthemius and the previous pope. Just 3 years earlier, in a law dated to 469, Anthemius, with Leo, had passed a law condemning the sale of church office. The language is pretty harsh. Let the profane ardor of avarice cease to threaten our altars, and let this disgraceful crime be banished. Therefore, in our times, chaste and humble bishops are elected, so that wherever they may go, they will purify everything with the morality of their own lives. Let a priest be ordained not with money, but with prayers. It's striking, in fact, that the only law to survive from the Emperor Glycerius, passed just days after taking office in March 473, reiterates this very same set of stipulations in similarly moralizing language in an attempt to curb the actions of the then Pope Simplicius. Glycerius's law, which we'll come to, this is the other law, sorry. Glycerius's law reiterated restrictions on the sale of church office in similarly moralizing language. It's filled with the same kind of righteous indignation, but not just at bishops, but also at the clergy who follow them in what he calls abusive practices. And this is the law of Glycerius. From this practice, it has developed that selling church office, that secular power is valued more than reverence for the priests, so that those who are called priests prefer to be tyrant-governed citizens, tyranno politas. Roman aristocrats had been concerned that such abuses would tarnish the moral authority of bishops and clergy, and this fear is expressed by Glycerius, who not only condemned this practice as dishonorable greed, but he also suggests that it was one of the reasons for the cause of the Civil War. And this is the continuation of the law. From which reason we believe that it has happened that the deity was offended, which we recognize because we have suffered so many evils. averted the favor of its majesty and wears out the Roman people with such great misfortunes, which have thus transpired. Gregarius's explanation for the war would appeal to a number of Anthemius's previous supporters. Certainly blaming the recent civil strife on such moral abuses is a good way to explain it and to justify intervention in this sort of financial abuse. External controls on the finances of the clergy may have been one other consideration that led the then Pope Simplicius to respond forcefully to such charges. In a letter dated to 475, Pope Simplicius stipulated for the first time in the 5th century Church of Rome how the revenues to the church should be divided. The famous fourfold division of funds equally between bishop, clergy, church workers, and the poor. Simplicius's letter was a response to complaints by 3 Italian bishops, but it also addressed ongoing concerns of wealthy donors, central aristocrats, about the sale of goods and especially liturgical vessels that they had given. Indeed, this is an ongoing problem. We see it recur in a document known as the Testamentum or the Scriptura of 483, where Simplicius, again on his deathbed, promises that clergy should not sell donated charitable goods for fear of diminishing the salvific effects. And it's an ongoing problem. In fact, skipping ahead to the Ostrogothic kingdom in 530, the Senate actually passed a law, a consulta, outlawing the sale of church office. So it becomes something that the Senate really is deeply concerned with. And again, by 530, a law is passed. So just to summarize, and I've gone fast, quickly. Wow. After 472, Roman senators in alliance with military leaders worked to ensure the survival of Rome, and they supported weak imperial figures to that end. The weakening of the imperial authority in the West set the stage for its removal. When the new emperor, Eastern Emperor, Zeno, sent his new candidate for the throne, the general Nepos, Glycerius fled without fight. And some say he became Bishop of Salona in modern Split, that is in Pannonia. The throne was not worth fighting for. The senators, though, went along with the stronger military leader. Nepos, however, made several crucial errors from the perspective of the Senate. He failed to build ties with them, and he chose to rule from Ravenna. When Nepos's general Orestes revolted in 476, and made his 14-year-old son Romulus the emperor, Nepos went into exile in Dalmatia. Senate didn't stop him, nor did they support Romulus against the stronger and more politically savvy general Odoacer, who had been apparently working with the Senate behind the scenes and allied with them very soon. In fact, in a quite famous fragment from the later Eastern historian Malchus, in 476, we were told that Augustus forced Anici, the Senate, Anici, forced the Senate to send an embassy to the Eastern Emperor, asserting that, quote, there was no need of a divided rule and that one shared emperor was sufficient for both territories. More than that, the Senate took this action voluntarily because, as the central ambassador said, they had chosen Odoacer, a man of military and political experience, to safeguard their own affairs, Fragmenta, and that Zeno should confer upon him the rank of patrician and entrust him with the government of Italy. They wanted to protect not their affairs, but their property. Moreover, the Senate did not mention Nepos at all. By denying Nepos's existence, the central envoys negated his legitimacy. They did, however, attest to their allegiance to the Eastern Emperor in an effort to forestall his intervention in Italy. Clearly, the Senate had been working behind the scenes to instigate the exile of one emperor and the retirement of another. And now they were working with Odoacer. The Eastern Emperor Zeno, only recently back in control of Constantinople, was not inclined to accept this arrangement, but there's little reason to suspect that the senators were unhappy with it. If we look at the men who took positions that were filled at this point, and I just give you a selection of some of the work that they've done on civic office holders under Odoacer. Odoacer's 13-year rule, it's clear that certain families did remarkably well. 6 offices plus consulships from 480 after the death of Nepos went to civic offices. 6 offices plus consulships from 480 were used for this chart. 16 of the possible 87 high civic office holders can be securely dated to the reign of Odoacer, or approximately 1/6 of the total. The men who held this position shared certain characteristics, and taken as a group, they point to some significant trends in how elite contestation for influence in Rome continued to fuel the recovery of the city and Italy in the 480s. The established Roman families are most visible. Of the 16 men with positions of consulship attested under Odoacer, 9 are from 6 powerful established Roman families: the Decii, the Anici, the Civici, the Petronii, Ancilii, Glabiones, and the Boethii. If we assume them to be from another aristocratic family, also the Severina family, and one Italian aristocratic family, Cassiodorus, or the Cassiodori. The Decii, as several scholars have observed, did particularly well in this decade. They have 3 members of their family holding 3 high offices in this decade, in addition to 3 of the consulships. And they're in green. In contrast, other families, including Anici, held 1 or at most, in the case of the Petroni, 2 offices each. This who's who of elite families is smaller than the number in the early 5th century. There's no doubt about that. But nevertheless, they provide a strong core of old families who survived even into the 6th century, as they are later attested under Theodoric. So to conclude, what I hope that this talk has demonstrated, as will my book, is the resilience of senatorial aristocrats in alliance with the military and with papal elites, which allowed them to restore Rome as a center of political power in the 5th century. It became apparent to aristocrats in the wake of 472 that it was no longer desirable to have a resident Western emperor. The shared political rulership model was no longer effective in securing their things. The civil wars and the long periods over the course of the 5th century without a Western emperor had demonstrated that the Senate and senators could hold power, but they needed a strong military elite with whom to work to provide protection. When a new, stronger military elite emerged, that is Theodoric, they shut the gates of the city against him and changed their alliances. While I emphasize the resilience of Roman elites in response to this crisis, the catastrophist paradigm focuses on these same events and sees them as setting the city and its inhabitants on an ever downward, virtually unavoidable spiral. And that approach, I think, has underestimated the political and economic strength of Romans and their institutions, including the Senate, over the long durée. So rather than dismiss the delegation, for example, that sent in 476 from the Senate of Rome to the Eastern Emperor Zeno, the one that asserted that one emperor in the East was enough, rather than dismiss that as merely the ineffectual actions of a weak set of men manipulated by a strong general, which scholars have, I argue that the embassy was an expression of the changed political goals of still powerful and wealthy Western senators. The decision to align themselves with Odoacer mattered. Certainly, Rome, by the end of the 5th century, had declined in size. Its horizons were narrower. But it did not fall in 476, as Gibbon was well aware. When Nepos died in exile in 480, the senators and the German general Odoacer had already been at work rebuilding Rome for some 8 years. Odoacer, who chose to remove himself to Ravenna, acknowledged the dominant role of the senatorial aristocracy in Rome. So too had the papacy seen the need to restrict financial abuses to ensure the ongoing support of Roman aristocratic patrons. In fact, Simplicius's successor, Felix, made close ties with them, even marrying his daughter to one of the Anici, as I argued in an article in the Journal of Early Christian Studies. Aristocratic influence thus continued to shape Rome's religious identity, despite the rhetoric in texts such as the Book of the Popes, a 6th century collection of papal biographies. The bishops of Rome remained weak civic leaders through the end of the 5th century. Senatorial aristocrats, patrons, and protectors of the bishops of Rome were able to assert stronger controls over what they saw as the financial abuses of the bishop and the church in Rome. The dominant influence of senatorial aristocrats in Rome in alliance with German military elites in Ravenna brought relative prosperity to Rome and its elites, who were now firmly in charge of their city. It also benefited, I should add, their retainers and non-elite citizens whose lives were bound up with those in charge of the city. This happy state of affairs would continue under Odoacer's successor, Theodoric, and brought a period of peace in the late 5th and early 6th centuries, until the intervention again of an Eastern emperor, Justinian. How Roman elites survived Justinian's war of reconquest is the subject of my next chapter, but that's a paper for another day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Salzman. And I would like to start the discussion. So again, if you have a question, please send your name or the question, and I will read it for you. If you don't mind, I wish to start. And I wanted to ask you if you can elaborate a little bit more about the other case studies that appear in your book, because you demonstrated one, and just for the sake of the argument, I would like to hear a little bit about the rest.
Well, thank you for that question. I should say that one of the through lines of the book is that I look at these same families over the longue durée. So the Anici, the Decii, the Civici, who appear in this chapter. Also, I begin with Constantine in the early 4th century, and I look at in particular, because the evidence is there, I look at those people who were the high civic office holders. So those who were urban prefects of Rome, or what I call the mayor, are very critical, and they become even more powerful in the 4th century because of the removal of the Praetorian Guard from Rome. And so the urban prefect is the only one who really has access to a police force in the city, but they're the ones who have financial and responsibility. So I look at urban prefects all through these various chapters and look at who is being appointed to which positions. There is an administrative shift that happens over the course of the 4th century. And so Praetorian prefects become really important. I also look at those members who are appointed to the imperial court. So I have many tables. That was a selected table that I gave you. But I have tables for all these different offices for every crisis, for every period I'm looking at under different emperors. And I go through until, and I hadn't planned to, I go up until the early 7th century, because my question was what happened to these senatorial aristocratic families? And so I even look at, when they will die out, when's the last evidence for them that we have. And so the letters of Gregory, and I look at the evidence for patrician status. So I have a whole section looking at who are made patricians, because this is an honorific title that was reinstituted by Constantine, and it becomes extremely important as a way of honoring, incorporating people at high levels of status. And so my last chapter looks at who are the patricians in post-Gothic War Italy. And then not the Roman senatorial aristocracy. So it's a giveaway, but it's, so I have lots of prosopographic data about these families. And I really was trying to find out why, what happened to them after the Gothic War, because they could well have come back after the Gothic War, I argue, but they didn't. And the reasons are not simply the war, I think. Anyway, thanks for the question.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Hans Hammer.
Hello, Michele. Well, my question is how your argument would fit with Wickham's, which takes a broader view of the late Roman aristocracy in the West, and says the idea that the breaking of the fiscal spine of the empire when the Vandals seized North Africa also narrowed the horizons necessarily of the Roman aristocracy.
Right. I don't fully agree with his idea that it broke the aristocracy. So I suppose I agree that there are narrowing horizons. The focus on Italy has reduced the possibilities, but the senatorial aristocracy, you can see, were able to survive the Vandal invasions, and even certainly through 455, tribute from the Vandals are paying for the food of Rome. And after 455, we still see senatorial estates in Italy, in southern Italy especially, providing food for Rome. And so the senatorial families of Rome are able to maintain their economic ties far more effectively than he would allow. And you can sort of get hints of it, but you can see, Sidonius talks about grain ships coming from Brundusium, which is southern Italy on the coast. And so you have continuing trade and continuing financial sources for the Roman aristocracy. So I think, eventually, where I differ from him is saying he thinks it happened then, that the Vandals are sort of the end and the tax base has disappeared. And I don't think that, I think the state is weakened, but these elite families and their wealth and their sources of social prestige as well as financial wealth continue. They have ties, and you could trace these ties even across the East. So Nicias Olybrius, for instance, fled Rome after 455. He went to Constantinople, had a huge building estate, had family there who stayed there. When he came back to the West, he was made emperor in part because he was so wealthy. They had huge amounts of wealth still at their resources. So, over the, into the Middle Ages, I think by the 7th century, I think things have radically shifted, but it's not happening as soon. And it's not the Vandals that are the problem immediately, not for senatorial aristocrats generally. There is a refocusing on Italy. That is true. The estates in Gaul are no longer, especially northern Gaul, are no longer part of the resources coming in to the senatorial aristocrats. So yeah, it's a great question. I just think that his focus is too broad, and I'm slowing down the developments that he's talking about. I think there's been a tendency to underestimate what's happening in the 5th century in Italy because of a march forward. So I think it's 50 years under the Ostrogoths, there was a resurgence, but the goods, the connections, the social connections, economic connections, And archaeology, which has changed since the time of Wickham's book, has shown the vitality in Apulia, Sicily. There's been Emmanuel Vaccaro has done really interesting work on synthesizing Sicilian excavations. And there's been this tendency to say everything stopped after 455 with the Vandals. And in fact, the evidence, the pottery shows that's not the case, that it's a much more gradual downturn in these places. So it's not pointing to the Vandals. So, yeah. Thanks for the question.
Our next question is from Paul Fredrickson. Paula, would you like to ask or shall I? I'll do it then. Okay, would you say that power pooled more around Ravenna by the 6th century, or does Rome's cultural capital prevail?
Could you repeat that again? I missed the first thing.
Would you say that power pooled more around Ravenna by the 6th century, or does Rome's cultural capital prevail?
That's a great question, Paula. I think there are two nodes of political power going on in the 6th century. So in the early 6th century, I think Rome's and the letters of Cassiodorus, where the kings are referring or writing to the Senate, suggest strongly to me, as well as the people who are serving the Ostrogothic kings, are still showing Rome to have tremendous cultural, political, and symbolic capital in the early 6th century. So I think there are two nodes that influence going on in the early 6th century.
Where's the armies?
What?
Where's the muscle? Where's the armies? Who has control of the army?
I think it's clearly it's the Ostrogothic king has control of the army. On the other hand, and that's but you don't rule simply by force, right? You need to have the support of elites, and Theodoric especially was very careful to bring along senatorial aristocrats and appoint them to office. And so, yeah.
So would you go along with Jim O'Donnell's contrarian history that he was the last great emperor of Rome? Not Jim, but really the Ostrogothic strongman as the last Roman emperor, precisely because he had to work through the mediation of the Roman Senate to get the trains to run on time.
Yeah, I like that, and Jim, in some ways I would agree with that. And so does Procopius call him, he's an emperor. He's more of he is an emperor. He's a usurper, but he's an emperor. So it's a very strange conjunction. I mean, I think he's styling himself as a Roman emperor, but without the formal trappings, of course, because he doesn't want to alienate. Yeah. But I think he's negotiating his power through senatorial elites, as did Odoacer. I think Theodoric is following very much Odoacer's footsteps. Those 13 years when Odoacer was in power were really critical for setting up a model and maintaining authority. I think it's quite striking that Theodoric never issues any barbarian law codes, right? The Burgundians do, the Visigoths do. He doesn't, right? So it's, he's very much trying to, yeah. So I think I would support that position.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, great question.
Sorry.
Go ahead, sorry.
Our next question is from Merle Eisenberg.
Thanks, Michele. See you again. So my question kind of actually builds on Hans's question, but I'm curious how you build in the elite question. So in regards to the tax system, do you see the development of what's happening across our own world, which is to say kind of big men, big landowners controlling the tax system more and more across the 5th and 6th century, and rather than say a curial system, obviously. And do you see that as helping the aristocracy in Rome be more resilient over time, right? That they're the ones controlling the nodes of collecting the taxes, which would obviously allow them to support their power over time.
Yeah, I do actually. Although I think there were shifts. I think up until the Eastern, I'll call them Byzantines, until the Eastern Romans come, because I think the traditional modes where, as officials, as praetorian prefects, as comes of the re sacri palati, when they're on the, they have access to funds, and they are very, that's one of the ways that they protect their wealth, because they can use their positions to not pay taxes, or pay taxes, or or send men or not from their estates. So I think that system is retained through Odoacer, and then through the Ostrogothic kingdom. Oddly enough, when the Justinian comes in and the Byzantines come in, if you look at the pragmatic sanction, you can see that the collection of taxes is now being given over to Byzantine administrators with a consultation of local landowners, some of whom are still centaur aristocrats, but you don't have to therefore be a high civic office holder under the Byzantines. And so there is a real undermining, in my opinion, real undermining of the value of holding high civic office. And that's when we see the centaur elites leaving Rome and moving into their estates. So that's where I really see the unraveling of the system in the post-Gothic War period, not because of the war, but mostly because having to do with things like taxation and the demise of any kind of real political and economic power from those who are holding, office under the Byzantines. Right? So I see the break happening with 554, with the pragmatic sanction in the post-Gothic War period. Up until that time, I think, and that's why holding office is so important. It's not just the status, although there's that, but there's also the power, the connections, the ability to, oversee who gets to pay taxes and not, to intervene. There's all these extra legal ways. Yeah, it's a great question, Earl. Yeah, but that's how I would see it functioning until the post-Gothic War period. Through the Gothic War period, it's hard to know what's going on because it goes back and forth so often, and the taxes seem, depends on who owns it. But there's a really great passage when Toptia turns on the Romans and saying, why are you, see how hard it is to live under the Byzantines. They make collecting taxes so hard. We were never as hard, and he's right in a certain sense. So yeah. So I do think the Byzantine solution was undermined that position. Yeah.
Next, we have a comment from Richard Abels. Feel free to elaborate if you'd like. The lecture made me think of a different sort of continuity, the persistence of the so-called 3rd century crisis into the 4th and 5th centuries. If you'd like to elaborate, or Professor Salzman, if you want to respond to that.
That's an interesting connection. I guess I see, I don't quite see it that way. Well, insofar as the 3rd century crisis was a failure after 235 to, constant internal usurpations and difficulty of holding on to any one emperor holding on to power long enough to reassert authority until Diocletian. I think that's true, but it's only true for certain periods. I think one of the strange things about the 5th century is that there are long periods of time when things were really relatively calm, and very much depending on where you lived. So the focus, the really sort of messy parts happen, after the Vandals sack Rome, after the end of Valentinian III. So between 455 and 476, you might say, that 20-year period has some of the earmarkings of the 3rd century. There, I think you're right. But I think that there are some, structural problems that the Romans never really got solved really easily. Dynastic change is always scary, and as we now see in the United States, right? After the recent election, it is a times of transition are dangerous moments. So yeah, so I guess I think that there were parts of the 5th century that were very much like living under Constantine. Constantine's rule began with a crisis, but and there were civil wars, but on the whole, the 4th century was predominantly one in which things seemed to work, but on a new basis. But it's an interesting comparison.
Oded, would you like to ask your question? Oh, you have to unmute yourself.
Got it. Hi. First of all, I really loved the lecture. And I love the idea of agency among the Roman elite. And it made me think that probably the same thing was happening in the provinces as the provinces were being taken over, the same sort of negotiations and the same sort of ability to be able to weather the changes by continuing to be an elite under new quote unquote rulers. But what struck me is, and this was something I was doing as an undergraduate teacher, and you 3rd century, Diocletian, Restoration, Constantine, and then what you have is the barbarians come in, you have Adrianople, 378, and that's the story, right? But when I was looking at all of the military actions in the 4th century and just tabulating them, the overwhelming number of military actions were Roman armies against other Roman armies in various places in order to be able to stop or facilitate quote unquote usurpations. It struck me that the barbarians were almost they were almost an irrelevancy. They were seen as being possible forces that could be used by one or another of the claimants, but they were not the main concern of any of the Roman emperors. The main concern of the Roman emperors were other Roman armies. And that seems to be true throughout the entire 4th century.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And having just taught the 5th century, I think to a large degree, that's also the case. Although what's different in the 5th century is that you do have a loss of control of certain areas, right? So which already happens in the 4th century, but to a much larger degree. So, but on the other hand, the Vandal invasion of North Africa was facilitated because of internal fighting between Gallipoli and Boniface, if you take the story. So you're right. It's the that's why I don't agree with Peter Hether's notion,
Yes.
for instance, that it's just the barbarians. It's not the barbarians; it's the failure to address them. And yes, internal usurpation is certainly an ongoing endemic problem, right? That. But you had that in 69 early, but yeah, so it's just they never could get that straight. But it's I take your point. I think it's a good episode.
And the elites had practice with being able to adjust to the changing political circumstances. They had to in order to remain elites.
Yes, well, and I think what's different in the 5th well, it begins in the 4th and the 5th century, as I argue in the chapter on Constantine, is they are very good at reasserting their position in society under Constantine. There has been even more new work showing that they were also effective to some degree under Diocletian, but the changes in how one enters the senatorial class, making it hereditary, and the widening of positions that allowed for a senatorial rank, mean that elites, especially, there's a kind of internal fighting among the elites where the wealthiest elites come out at the top of the senatorial class. So we have different levels, the illustres, spectabulos, and clarissimi, and the illustres become more and more powerful over the course of the 4th century. So they're very good at negotiating power with whoever they need to negotiate with. And so by the 5th century, they become really adept at that. So yeah, so I think your observation is very well taken. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing, giving them agency, because they, I'll use Chris Wickham, if you see it all in terms of large economic forces, individual actions don't matter. But I've been, my counter to that is really to sort of focus on what they can do and do as a way of maintaining their position, albeit in a smaller empire, it's still an empire from their perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oded.
Thank you, Michele, for this lovely presentation. In a way, if I'm right, this is a re-endorsement of Brian Croke's assessment that the 476 date is a concoction of the Eastern intellectuals, like people like Jordanes, who actually went from the West to the East and were awaiting the end of the old Rome. So you've just set it in from the point of view of Rome, this resurgence as a counter to this mood from Constantinople. My question, on the other hand, is whether I want to press you on the anxiety about 2 decades earlier by people like Sidonius Apollinaris, Hidatius of Lemica, and a whole crowd about the end, the coming end of Rome, and that's only 2 decades earlier. So how do you explain this extreme anxiety?
Thank you, Oded. Well, 2 points. One is, yes, I think Brian Croke wrote a brilliant article, and I totally agree with it. And it's, I think, Marcellinus Comes is the first person who dates the 476, talks about the fall of Rome. So I think it's very much a Byzantine construct. I don't think, I agree with you entirely. I think the senators in the 5th century, post 476, thought they were Romans living in an empire. The emperor just wasn't in Rome. So that's it. I don't, about the Sidonius Apollinaris and the anxiety, I know that is Jill Harry's thesis, but I'm not convinced that it's true as much as she is. I don't think that there are negative voices, but they never talk about the fall of Rome. And Sidonius is much more concerned with local matters, and he's very dissatisfied with the other bishops who have not supported him in his attempt to hold on to Clermont. So I think he's talking really about moments having to do with the loss of local autonomy in Clermont. So I don't see him. I mean, there are moments of despair, you might say, or what's the word? What would be the word? Despair, pessimism, all throughout Roman literature. It would be hard not to see that even in Livy, living under Augustus. So I think that it's overstated in terms of Sidonius, that I don't see him working under the shadow. He doesn't talk about the end of the Roman Empire. He just talks about disappointment and the failures. In fact, I have a graduate student working on a PhD on Sidonius and Apollinaris, and so I don't see it, and I don't see it as I don't see his work sort of pointing that direction. He never says the empire is no more, right? When he does talk about moments of hope, for instance, when Anthemius is marrying Wickham and Sidonius is in Rome, and he's negotiating these political events. He's much in his letters, he's much more directed, but he doesn't talk about the end of the empire. What he's unhappy about is that he's losing control of Clermont when he becomes bishop. He's not, and part of the dissatisfaction is that he doesn't have the support of other bishops in Gaul. So there's partially that. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I don't see him as having the perception that the empire is no more. He's lost control of the city. He doesn't particularly like living under the Visigoths, but I don't think he sees this as the end of the empire. Yeah.
But others did. Hydacius does mention the end of the empire.
Hydacius has a very negative, well, he ends, is it 458? 468, yeah. He is more negative about it. But, he sees the loss of Spain. He is negative about the loss of Spain. There's no doubt, and regional differences are there. There's no doubt about it. So he's negative about it. But I don't think that he is talking. Well, he's talking about the fall, and in his chronicle, he is talking about the Western Empire, but he doesn't talk about it as a complete end. And nor is he in Rome, right? He's in Spain. So I think, in provincial areas, there's the loss of imperial control in those areas is what they're talking about. But and he does say the Western Empire is not functioning there. It's not present there. But the empire at large has not disappeared. It's just not in Spain or in Gaul.
He has an apocalyptic mood. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, it is an apocalyptic view. Yeah, I mean, that's the other point of view. And he's not a senator aristocrat.
No.
So I think that would be the other point. I don't, I'd have to look at the language of Hydacius more, but he's talking about, the death and demise and of Western imperial control in Spain more than he is about the empire, as a statement about the empire, is what I remember. I'd have to go take a look again. Thank you.
Our next question is from Dimitri Starostin.
Yes, hello. I hope you can hear me. Coming to you from Russia, actually.
Oh,
thank you. The question occurred to me about the use of embassies by Romans, and the Romans were actually very good at that, at sending embassies to barbarians, actually, until the 5th century. In the end of this century, of course, with the emergence of the Frankish kingdom and so on, I don't see that much information about embassies. So can you say there is a kind of a transformation of this whole practice of embassies when they get Theodoric the Great, essentially, and when he enters marital alliances with the King of France and so on? Is there a need anymore for embassies? What do you think?
Thank you, Dimitri, for the question. I do think that there are continuing embassies between the different German kings, and that the senators are useful for that. Although I have not myself focused on that as much, but it's a very good point. I know that, that there are embassies going from Gaul to Rome. I've been mostly focused on the sort of Rome-based action, but I do, there are instances of embassies going to the Vandal kings, for instance. Zeno sent to the Vandal king Gaiswick an embassy to get him to stop attacking Italy. Didn't work, but so that's one example that comes to my mind of the continuation of embassies to the the Vandals, certainly in the 5th century. So yeah, I think there were continuing connections and diplomacy going on throughout the 5th century, for sure. It's a good question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now we have a question from Denis Sukino Komenko. I hope I didn't slaughter your last name, I'm sorry. So the question is, as you mentioned how for the Eastern Romans, the empire doesn't function in the West, how would she or you, sorry, conceptualize this non-functioning both for them and for us today? Suppose that civil government on the local level still carried out its rootedness as before. It is that this government does not report to an emperor in Constantinople that makes it not imperial.
Well, thank you for that, for a challenging question. I was talking about, I think I was referencing the post-Gothic War period, where I talked about how the Byzantines were now, what I call Byzantines or East Romans, were now in charge of Italy. And to, I think that's what I was referencing, and please clarify if I'm wrong. And what I've looked at in the post-Gothic War period is Justinian's pragmatic sanction, which are various legal laws which were put together more or less, or have been accrued into a document, even if they weren't posted all at once, which would look at governing Italy. And that if you look at these different constitutions, I should say, for Italy, the way in which taxes were collected is different, because it's a radical difference, because it gives the collection of taxes back to local people and in conjunction with bishops in their cities. And that would mean that the once key role that that civic magistrates played, that senators played in helping to collect taxes and oversee government, was no longer necessary. And it fits in with what Justinian does in other places as well, where he reverts and is trying to undermine the authority of the senatorial senators or the aristocrats in the East. And he applies this as well to Italy, which has, I think, a very which undermines the value of holding office from a Western senatorial perspective. You don't have to hold office. You could have all of these authority on a local level to control and protect your estates, because most of the wealth of these aristocrats was in land, as we know. So that's what I was talking about. Yeah, so there's in some ways a return to, or a turn to more local control, and which sort of gives you the slide into the Middle Ages, you could say. And it happens in Italy very much in conjunction with East Roman legal changes that you see emerging in the later 6th century after the Gothic Wars. So that's what I was trying to explain. I hope that helps.
Shahal?
Thank you, Professor Salzman, for this fascinating talk. My question is somehow a follow-up to the question that we've just heard concerning local power. So if I think about the Gallic case of aristocratic families reasserting their power through a shift in occupation, let's say. So they're more and more present in as bishops, right, and episcopal sees, to use the words of Martin Heinzelmann, as episcopal dynasties. Do we see the same sort of thing happening in Italy? So the aristocratic families shifting in occupations, if you might want to call it this.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for that question, and it's exactly one of my hobby horses. I think Henselmann's views have been very influential. I mean, and Ralph Matheson has also made this argument, but more recent work has shown that even in Gaul, it's in a much more limited. There are more limited places where we see aristocrats becoming bishops, taking on the clerical role. It's much more in in certain sections, southern parts of France, and not all of Gaul, certainly. So it's a more limited phenomenon. I think it happens, you see it more readily, I think, in the East. And I have argued in an article in Journal of Early Christian Studies that we don't actually have the same phenomenon at all in Italy, that the first bishop who has any kind of aristocratic family lines really is Vigilius in the context of the Gothic War. So it's not the late 5th century bishop Felix. So we do not have senators becoming bishops in Rome up until the Gothic Wars, which is phenomenal. And the reason I think that's the case, why it's so important, not simply, is because aristocrats don't need to enter the clerical orders in order to have influence over religion. They're patrons. They intervene as urban prefects. If you think of the example of Praetextatus intervening and making Damasus the Pope in the late 4th century, it's mind-boggling, because he's the one who, as urban prefect, has the authority to resolve all this internal fighting. And so it's really not it's not an easy, one time when I was younger, in my first book, I thought it was an easy slide from senatorial aristocrat into bishopric. And I'm totally disagree with that now. It was not until the mid 6th century, now I would say to my younger self, that you actually see any kind of aristocrats. And that's because the civic options in the course of the Gothic War had really been diminished, and there aren't those possibilities for having the kind of presence, impact, influence that you would have had. So in some ways, in Gaul, in those places, like Sidonius is a perfect example. We have no idea why he became bishop, really, but he clearly was left out of the secular world. And it was a way, for him to maintain a kind of presence. But in Italy and Rome, you didn't have that phenomenon. So even in the late 5th century, in the Acacian Schism, for instance, we know from documents that secular senatorial elites were involved in episcopal elections from early on. They get involved as the Senate in adjudicating things, and they don't need to be bishops in order to have an important role on church policy, on who's the next bishop, on various other things. So yeah, it's a very different situation. We're having sort of regional identities playing out So it's a great, thank you for the question, because it's really one of the things that I think is so distinct about the bishops of Rome, that they really do not have the kind of influence that they will claim in the 6th century. And in fact, I think they claim it in the 6th century in the Book of the Popes is so important as a source, because they need to make a position vis-a-vis Justinian and the Eastern court, so that kind of refashioning becomes all the more politically important, but it doesn't reflect real political realities. I'm not saying that the bishops of Rome don't have any civic influence, they do, but it's not the same confluence of senators moving easily into the church and putting on the bishop's mitre. It's a much more delayed phenomenon. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I could go on.
We'll have to end our discussion here because we're out of time. But please join me again in thanking Professor Michele Salzman for a wonderful and stimulating talk. It was wonderful, so thank you very much. Our next and last meeting for the current academic year will take place on July 1st. Our next speaker is Professor Ian Wood of the University of Leeds, who will give a talk about Beyond the Transformation of the Roman West. And we will circulate the flyer soon, so stay tuned. Thank you everyone for joining. Stay healthy, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you all.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.